Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
So, about a week ago, something quite unexpected happened. Really shifted things. U.S. President Trump announced the United States would halt defensive weapons shipments to Ukraine.
Right, the interceptors, the artillery shells.
Exactly, the critical stuff. Long-range interceptors, 155-millimeter shells, vital. And, well, it really caught Ukraine off guard.
They weren't expecting that at all.
No, definitely not. They were immediately asking the White House for clarification. Then we saw, a series of phone calls, U.S. President Trump with Russian President Putin.
And also with Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Yes, that's separate call too. Fast forward to last night, and it's a complete reversal. The weapon shipments are back on.
A real whiplash.
Totally.
Yeah. So,
for our deep dive today, we need to understand these really rapid changes, what's driving them, what does it mean for the war, and crucially, how does Russia view all this?
It's quite something how fast these things pivot. And there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Definitely seems that way.
A key piece here, I think, is the state of U.S. weapons stockpiles. They are, frankly, quite depleted.
That's a major factor then.
It's a significant strategic vulnerability, yes.
Okay, let's unpack that. This reversal, the one from last night, it happened right after U.S. President Trump met with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Interesting timing.
Yeah, the main focus was the Middle East Gaza ceasefire, Iran, but then a reporter asked specifically about Ukraine.
Okay.
And U.S. President Trump's response was pretty blunt. He said, and I'm quoting here, "We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. So many people are dying in that mess."
It's a perspective that perhaps overemphasizes how much U.S. weapons alone can coerce decisions, assuming that just, turning the tap on or off forces an outcome.
Right. The reality is more complicated.
Much more. And as I mentioned, the stockpile depletion is critical. But there's another layer less talked about: China's restrictions on rare earth deliveries.
Rare earths. How does that connect?
It directly impacts the military-industrial complex. Companies like Boeing, for instance. It hinders production of crucial systems, like the Arrow 3 missile Israel uses.
I see. So it's not just about existing stock, but the ability to make more.
Exactly. Think about this. A single F-35 jet needs 400 kilograms of rare earths.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is. It highlights the scale of the supply chain issue. It creates a real strategic problem for producing new equipment. Affects Patriots, Arrow missiles, all sorts of advanced systems.
That really paints a stark picture of dependency, and it makes the recent back and forth even more confusing because just days before this latest announcement, around July 1st, Deputy Secretary of Defense KBY apparently did an analysis recommending cutting off those interceptor missiles specifically because U.S. stockpiles were critically low.
So an internal assessment confirmed the problem.
Seems so. Yeah. And that decision went public. Ukraine, as we said, was blindsided, seeking answers from Washington urgently.
Right.
Then, the very next morning, Ambassador Whitaker goes on Fox News, calls the decision America first. His explanation was about prioritizing U.S. strategic defense, projecting power, needing enough Patriot missiles for America's own defense. He even brought up B-2 bombers and past operations against Iran as examples of U.S. strength.
Trying to frame it as strength, despite the underlying issue.
Exactly. But it definitely sparked concerns in Washington and Europe about U.S. readiness. Is the U.S. secure itself?
Understandable questions.
But then, almost immediately, the Pentagon, through spokesperson Sean Parnell, issues a clarification.
Backtracking.
Essentially saying the U.S. has plenty of weapons, and that the DoD is still giving U.S. President Trump robust options for Ukraine aid, consistent with ending the war, U.S. readiness, and America first.
So, plenty of weapons, but also critically low stockpiles needing a cutoff just days earlier.
That's the apparent contradiction. The Pentagon's own analysis on July 3rd suggested a problem. Then just 2 days later, U.S. President Trump orders more weapons sent, seemingly without the previous conditions.
Well, putting it together, it suggests that, yes, the U.S. might have the existing capacity for this shipment, but the fundamental problem, the inability to quickly refill those stockpiles, remains.
Because of the raw materials, the rare earths.
Precisely. That raw material shortage, particularly strategic rare earths, is the bottleneck. Studies point to this dependence, especially on China, for weapon production. It's a significant vulnerability.
And ties into trade policies too, presumably.
It does. And there's another tactical point here. this saturation strategy we've seen Iran use against Israel and Russia against Ukraine.
Explain that.
It's designed to overwhelm defenses. You force the defender to fire off their air defense missiles very quickly. Existing stockpiles, they just weren't built for this kind of high-intensity, nonstop warfare.
So even if you have good defenses, you can run out of ammo fast.
Exactly. Your ability to sustain defense under constant attack is limited by how fast you burn through missiles and how fast you can replace them. Which brings us back to the production issue.
Okay, so this whole policy flip-flop is happening against that backdrop. But what about Russia? How are they reacting, especially with Russian President Putin holding arguably a stronger hand on the battlefield right now? And U.S. President Trump recently said Russian President Putin was not being nice.
Yeah, the Russian position seems quite consistent, actually. U.S. President Trump perhaps hasn't fully grasped that from the Russian perspective, they believe they're winning on the battlefield.
Which means their demands are firm.
Very firm. They see them as critical for any negotiation. The non-negotiables haven't changed. Ukraine abandoning NATO aspirations and giving up sovereignty over Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson.
Those 4 regions.
Yes, and alternate ideas, like temporary freezes on NATO membership. Russia finds those unacceptable.
Russian President Putin stated these terms very clearly back on June 14th, 2024.
He did, methodically. And just recently, Foreign Minister Lavrov repeated them at a BRICS meeting.
Right, the BRICS Forum. He added the need for international recognition of Russian territory, too.
He did. It shows absolute consistency from their side. It fits their sort of Clausewitzian view war as a continuation of politics.
Meaning objectives can change based on the fighting.
Exactly. Objectives evolve. Initially, Russia talked about demilitarization, denazification, threats to Donbass. Now it's expanded. It includes protecting Russian populations in those 4 oblasts under Russian law, bringing them into Russia.
It's a shift.
It is. And remember, back in March 2022, Ukrainian President Zelensky himself floated abandoning NATO for Russian withdrawal. That deal fell apart, but the idea was on the table then.
So where does the fighting stand right now?
Well, reports indicate Russian forces are advancing in the Sumy area, also in the Siversk area, and they seem to be picking up the pace north and south of Pokrovsk.
And the air attacks.
Those are increasing too. Drones, missiles. And Ukraine's capacity to defend against all of it is, well, limited.
And Russian President Putin's recent comments at BRICS, using the term Novorossiya.
Yes, that's significant. He spoke about large-scale reconstruction in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, planning for the future there.
Which implies they expect to control them long term.
It certainly suggests an assumption of victory and control. And Novorossiya, historically, is a bigger concept.
Figure how?
It traditionally includes 4 more Ukrainian oblasts: Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv.
So mentioning it hints at potentially wider territorial aims.
It could imply that. It reflects, I think, a strategic shift towards a military solution, since negotiations look unlikely on terms acceptable to both sides.
So in that context, this latest U.S. decision to send weapons.
It's probably seen largely as a political declaration. It's unlikely, in my view, to fundamentally change the dynamics on the ground at this point.
It sounds like there are very different ideas of what ending the war even means.
Absolutely. U.S. President Trump talks about the silence of the guns. Russian President Putin wants a lasting peace, but on Russia's terms. Ukraine and Europe want peace, but without Russia's conditions. These are fundamentally incompatible goals right now.
Could the U.S. President Trump be using this renewed aid as leverage? Maybe to push Ukraine towards talks before he leaves office?
That's certainly a possibility, especially if European support is seen as making Ukraine less willing to negotiate right now. It could be a way to apply pressure.
Which brings us to sanctions. U.S. President Trump also mentioned seriously considering new sanctions against Russia, referencing a package the Senate apparently has ready.
Right. And on the other side, you have Lavrov at BRICS talking about multipolarity being an objective reality.
Replacing the outdated neoliberal model, as he put it.
Exactly. He argued that recent economic crises, COVID, exposed flaws in the global trade and financial systems, speeding up fragmentation.
And the use of sanctions.
He pointed to unilateral sanctions and the weaponization of the dollar eroding trust in the U.S. currency.
Makes sense.
Plus, you have rising debt in developing countries, even some developed ones, pushing them to look for independent development mechanisms. And BRICS is positioning itself as the driver for that change, aiming for a different global economic architecture, more universal, transparent, non-discriminatory, equal access.
Russian President Putin highlighted that BRICS plus members, about 20 countries, now represent 44% of global GDP. That's more than the G7.
It's a significant figure, and this whole BRICS movement is framed as defensive.
Defensive against what?
Against the U.S. weaponizing trade and the dollar. Countries are looking for ways to operate without needing U.S. compliance, essentially. Russian President Putin said last December he expects sanctions to be systemic, meaning they'll continue regardless.
But countries adapt.
They do. Look at Iran. Despite severe sanctions, they developed hypersonic missiles. Russia is now seen as a leader in electronic warfare, hypersonics, working closely with China.
So the idea is that the rest of the world is finding ways to operate independently of the West.
Increasingly so, yes. Strategically, defensively, creating their own trade models, their own payment systems. That was a key decision point at the BRICS summit in Kazan.
And U.S. President Trump's strategy? More tariffs.
Imposing additional tariffs on countries seen as having anti-American policies, yes. But some proposals, like the 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian oil, suggested by figures like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal.
Yes.
Well, critics argue that would essentially destroy international trade. It could end up isolating the U.S. more than impacting the target countries in the long run.
This deep dive has certainly revealed a lot. The complex weave of U.S. aid decisions, the critical resource vulnerabilities, Russia's unwavering demands, and this massive shift happening in the global economic order. It's a landscape in constant dramatic motion.
Indeed. Many interconnected parts, all moving very quickly.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.